The mustang had been trouble from the very first hour, and by midday the whole holding yard felt tightened with the kind of tension that made everyone speak just a little quieter. Dust floated in the air with the heat, and each time the wild horse slammed his hooves against the metal panels, the noise rolled across the open land like distant thunder. Folks standing near the fence kept stepping back, even the ones who swore they weren't scared. No one wanted to be the one that pushed him too far. He had been rounded up after weeks of reports. A wild mustang with a powerful build, too smart for traps, too strong for ropes, and too fast for most riders. The agents had spent hours trying to guide him into the loading trailer, but each attempt ended the same way. The horse reared up, kicked the gate, turned on anyone who moved too close, then threw himself against the panels until the whole structure rattled. It was the kind of behavior that made even seasoned handlers shake their heads. The narrator stood near the rail fence, arms resting on the sun-warmed wood, watching the scene with a growing sense of unease. They had seen difficult mustangs before, but nothing quite like this. There was something in the horse's eyes that went far beyond fear, a sharpness, a warning, as if he knew something none of the people gathered around him understood. The agents gathered in a small group near the trailer, discussing another strategy. Their voices carried just enough that the narrator caught pieces of their worry, too unpredictable, too dangerous, too much risk. One wrong move could get someone hurt, and no one was close to earning his trust. The horse had already snapped a rope halter that morning and nearly tore down the temporary gate when someone tried to corner him. The narrator breathed in slowly, dust settling on their jacket. The scent of dry grass and sweating horses filled the air. A few other locals stood nearby, murmuring about the mustang's strength and how no one had ever seen one fight this hard. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the horse was born wild in the canyons and had survived things no one should have survived. Others believed he had been abandoned long ago and no longer recognized kindness. Whatever truth lay in those stories, the horse made it clear he wasn't ready to trust anyone. As the sun moved higher, tension thickened. The agents tried again. One of them stepped into the pen, keeping his body angled low and calm, moving the flagstick gently. At first, the horse watched, nostrils flaring. Then he exploded again, charging forward, turning sharply, making the agent jump for the gate. The mustang skidded to a stop, dirt flying around him. The crowd gasped. The agent climbed out, shaking his head. The narrator felt their heartbeat tick up. Something had to change, or the day was only going to end in frustration. But nothing about the situation hinted at a sudden solution. Every attempt grew more intense. Every movement from the horse felt more desperate. Then the narrator noticed someone else standing at the edge of the holding yard. A girl, no older than 14 or 15, with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes fixed on the mustang like she had no intention of looking away. She didn't seem nervous. She didn't even flinch when the mustang kicked at the panel again. Her posture was calm, steady, almost thoughtful, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear. The narrator had seen her around before, quiet kid. Spent most of her time near horses. People said she had a way with them, but the narrator had never paid much attention. Right now, though, the focus in her eyes felt different. She wasn't just watching, she was studying every move the mustang made. One of the older ranch hands beside the narrator whispered, "That girl's been around wild horses her whole life. But even she should stay clear of this one." The narrator didn't answer. They kept watching her. Her gaze didn't waver when the mustang reared up again. She only tilted her head as if noticing something others had missed. An agent noticed her too and walked over. "Kid, best step back. This one's not for beginners." She didn't argue, she only nodded. But she didn't move either. The mustang stopped pacing for a moment and turned his head, looking straight at her. The air seemed to shift. It wasn't dramatic to anyone else, but the narrator felt a small jolt move up their spine. The horse's ears tilted forward, then flicked back, unsure. His breathing slowed just a little, barely noticeable unless someone was paying close attention. The girl took a single step forward, only one. Soft, deliberate, almost unnoticeable. The mustang's muscles tightened, but he didn't lash out. He only watched her, his sides heaving slightly. An agent called out again, asking her to stay back. The narrator expected her to listen this time. She didn't. Instead, she lifted her hand gently, palm open, nothing forceful or demanding in her gesture. For a moment, the world around the holding yard felt strangely quiet. Even the breeze softened. The narrator found themselves holding their breath. Something was happening, something none of the trained agents had managed to reach. The wild horse seemed torn between fear and recognition. He pawed the ground once, not aggressively, more like he was testing the moment. The girl remained still, her hand held out, her eyes steady. The mustang sniffed the air, lowering his head an inch. Dust floated between them. The narrator felt the weight of every second press around the yard. No one dared to speak. Another step. She moved so lightly that it almost looked like she was gliding. The mustang shifted back but didn't bolt. His tail flicked once, his ears darting around nervously, then returned to her. Someone murmured, "How is she doing that?" No one knew. The handful of people closest to the pen leaned forward without realizing. The agent stood frozen near the trailer. Even the mustang's hooves settled deeper into the dirt, as if grounding himself. The girl breathed slowly, almost in rhythm with the horse. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft enough that the narrator barely caught the words. "Easy now, I'm not here to take anything from you." The mustang blinked. A long, slow blink, the kind a horse gives when something inside them shifts from panic to curiosity. The narrator felt their heart jump. It was the first sign of peace the horse had shown all day. But the moment didn't last long. Before anything more could happen, a loud metallic clang echoed behind the yard. Someone had dropped a chain near the equipment shed. The sharp sound cut through the air like a blade. The mustang's entire body jolted. His head shot up, muscles tightening again, fear rising fast. Dust surged around him as he backed into the far corner of the pen. The girl stepped back too, but not out of fear. Her expression changed, worry settling in her eyes as she watched the mustang's panic return. One of the agents rushed forward, trying to regain control of the situation. But the horse struck the panel, rattling it so hard the narrator felt the vibration from where they stood. Another kick followed, then another. The mustang had returned to his wild panic, eyes wide, body trembling with every sound. People scrambled back to the fence. Some yelled for the agents to stay clear. Others argued that they should give the mustang space. The sun beat down, heating the metal panels, and the horse's fear grew stronger. The narrator's pulse raced. They could see the girl watching the mustang with a deep intensity, as if trying to reach him through the chaos. She looked toward the agents, then back at the horse as though she knew something they didn't. But she didn't step forward again. Not yet. The mustang slammed the panel again, harder this time, and the metal groaned under the blow. If he kept this up, the whole pen could give way. The yard fell into a hush filled only with the wild sound of hoofbeats and the desperate breathing of a horse that refused to be tamed. Everyone waited for someone to make the next move, but the girl's eyes stayed locked on the mustang. And the mustang, even in his panic, kept flicking his gaze back to her. The narrator felt a chill run through them. Something was building, something important. And it was only a matter of time before the horse made a choice that would change everything. If you'd like, I can continue with the next 1,200 words in the same tone. The mustang kept circling, his hooves dragging small trenches in the dirt as the dust settled back over the pen. The girl stood still where she had stopped earlier, her hands lowered now, but her focus never leaving the wild horse. Everyone else kept their distance. The agents returned to their quiet discussion, trying to decide on another plan, though anyone looking at them could see their confidence slipping. The narrator leaned back on the rail fence, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. No one had ever gotten that close to the mustang without him reacting like a storm breaking loose. Yet that girl had stepped into his world for a brief moment, and he had allowed it. It felt strange, almost unsettling, because it didn't follow the usual rules of handling wild horses. There had always been a method, something predictable even in chaos. But this mustang didn't follow anything known. The girl kept watching as if she had all the time in the world. The wind brushed lightly across the yard, carrying the dry scent of sage and the warm dust rising around the pen. The mustang's ears flicked in different directions, but his gaze kept returning to her before darting away again. It was like he didn't know whether to fear her or trust her. The narrator glanced at one of the older ranch hands again. The man crossed his arms over his chest and let out a low whistle under his breath. He must be reading something in the mustang's stance, too, because his expression had shifted from worry to something closer to curiosity. The agents finally called for a break, deciding to give the mustang time to settle before trying anything else. They stepped away from the pen, stretching their arms and talking in low voices. A few of them looked toward the girl again, still puzzled about how she had gotten that close without being chased off. Someone muttered something about beginner's luck, though it didn't sound convincing even to their own ears. The narrator couldn't shake the sense that there was more to her quiet bravery than luck. She moved with an understanding that didn't come from books or lessons. It was the kind of understanding formed through long hours watching, listening, learning, without anyone telling her the steps. It reminded the narrator of people who never needed to raise their voice or force their way in. They just had a natural way of connecting with the world around them. The girl finally stepped back from the fence, but she didn't walk away. Instead, she wandered to a patch of shade under a cottonwood tree. Her movements were slow, thoughtful, like she was thinking through everything she had seen. She sat down on the grass with her knees pulled up and watched the mustang from a distance. Not speaking to anyone, not seeking any attention. The mustang paced less now, though still alert, his tail swishing nervously. Every few seconds he lifted his head to look toward the tree. The narrator watched closely, half expecting the horse to settle again or break into another frenzy. The yard felt stuck between calm and tension, like a rope pulled tight but not yet snapping. A few locals gathered near the narrator, talking in hushed tones. Someone commented that the horse looked like he had been through something that left its mark. Another said they had heard stories about wild horses picking up strange habits when they felt trapped or separated from their herds. The narrator listened but didn't say anything. The mustang's behavior didn't feel like a simple reaction to being caught. It felt deeper, like he carried a weight nobody else could see. The break stretched on, and still the girl didn't move far. She picked up a handful of tall grass, rolling the stems between her fingers. Her eyes stayed on the mustang the whole time. The narrator wondered what she was thinking, or if she was waiting for the right moment to try again. The agent seemed ready to step back in, but even they hesitated now, glancing toward her as if expecting her to make another bold move. Eventually, one of the agents approached her. The narrator couldn't hear the whole conversation, but the agent crouched down, trying to speak gently. Maybe he was asking her not to step in again. Maybe he was thanking her for staying calm when the mustang reacted. The girl listened without interrupting, then nodded politely. The agent gave her a small smile before walking away. But even after that, she still didn't leave. She just waited. The narrator found their thoughts drifting back to the moment earlier when she had whispered to the mustang. Those few seconds had felt different from everything else that happened in the pen. It made the narrator wonder how someone so young had found that kind of confidence around such a strong horse. It didn't seem like the type of thing a child learned suddenly. It came from experience, patience, maybe even a connection formed long before today. The mustang let out a sharp snort, bringing the narrator back to the present. He lowered his head toward the ground, pawing at the dirt in short, agitated bursts. His sides moved with quick breaths, still unsettled, still unsure. Yet he didn't show the same wild fear he had at the beginning of the day. His focus had narrowed to her whether he wanted it or not. The narrator stepped closer to the fence for a better view. The mustang's coat was a deep shade of chestnut, darkening near his mane and fading lighter around his muzzle. His muscles rippled with every movement, powerful but tense. His eyes held a brightness that reflected both stubbornness and something like sorrow. It was rare to see such a clear mixture in a horse, and it made the narrator wonder what life he had before the agents brought him here. Someone nearby mentioned that the mustang had been seen leading a small band of horses through the hills. If that was true, losing his freedom would be even harder for him to accept. Horses like that didn't surrender easily. They resisted anything that felt like confinement. And that made the girl's earlier moment with him feel even more surprising. More locals arrived as the afternoon pushed on. Word had spread about the Mustang refusing to load, drawing curious eyes from nearby ranches. People leaned on fences, their hats pulled low, murmuring conversations drifting through the air. Most of them shared the same wary fascination. It wasn't often that a horse made even seasoned agents hesitate. That alone brought more attention. The girl remained under the cottonwood tree, still patiently watching. The agents gathered again, checking equipment, warming up their ropes, adjusting the position of the trailer. The narrator could feel the next attempt building. Everyone knew they couldn't wait forever. Eventually they would have to try again, no matter how difficult it became. But before the agents could enter the pen, the Mustang did something unexpected. He turned directly toward the cottonwood tree, ears pricked forward, body stiff. Not aggressive this time. Not fearful, something else, something unreadable. He stood perfectly still, his head lifted high, staring at the girl like she had suddenly become the only thing in his world. The narrator felt a ripple of surprise move through the crowd. People exchanged uneasy glances, even the agents paused mid-step. It was unusual enough that everyone fell silent again. The girl lifted her head slowly, meeting the Mustang's eyes across the distance. She didn't stand up. She didn't reach out her hand this time. She simply held his gaze, a calm quiet surrounding her like a small shelter from the tension around the yard. The Mustang took one step forward, then another. Someone whispered under their breath, asking if he was going to charge. Someone else told them to hush. The narrator leaned in, unable to look away. The Mustang's tail flicked softly. His steps were slow, careful, deliberate, as though each one required a decision. His gaze stayed locked on the girl the entire time. But before anyone could fully understand what he was doing, he stopped again, halfway between the center of the pen and the fence. His body trembled with some hidden conflict, his hooves digging lightly into the dirt. The girl rose to her feet. She brushed her hands against her trousers, took in a breath so subtle only someone watching closely would notice, and stepped toward the fence line. The Mustang watched her with a growing intensity that made the air feel heavier. The narrator's pulse quickened. Something in that moment felt important. Like the Mustang was waiting for her to make the next move. Like the entire yard was holding its breath again. But the girl stopped just short of the pen, her hands resting gently on the top rail. She didn't climb over, she didn't push forward, she waited. And the Mustang waited with her. Two stubborn souls locked in some quiet conversation no one else could hear. Around them the crowd stood still. The agents remained frozen near the trailer. Even the wind seemed to pause. Nothing happened next. But the way they stood there, facing each other, made it clear that the next step would change everything. And no one knew what that step would be. The night settled deeper around the house as if it was leaning closer, listening to every sound that moved through the narrow halls. A small lamp glowed on the table near the window, shaking a little whenever the wind touched the loose frame. Aries kept checking the shadows along the walls. Every corner felt alive. He tried to calm his breathing while convincing himself that everything had a normal explanation. Still, his thoughts kept returning to what had happened earlier, to that strange noise under the floor and the way the cupboard door had moved without anyone near it. He stepped into the main room and found Zoya standing near the old trunk. She had lifted the lid halfway and froze when she saw him walk in. Her hands trembled lightly. Aries asked her what she was doing, but she did not answer right away. She only pointed at a bundle of folded cloth inside the trunk. It looked ordinary at first, nothing more than worn fabric, but there was something unsettling about the way it was arranged. When Zoya finally spoke, her voice had a heavy weight to it. She said she had seen the cloth before in an old photograph of their grandmother. The fabric had symbols sewn inside, faint marks that looked harmless but carried an odd familiarity. Aries leaned closer, feeling a strange pull toward the patterns. The house was quiet except for the soft rustling of the trees outside. Aries felt the atmosphere grow thicker, as if the house was waiting for them to realize something important. Zoya asked if he had noticed how every room had small cracks near the ceilings, cracks shaped almost like the same marks on the cloth. He had seen them earlier but assumed they were signs of age. Now they seemed intentional. He tried to hold on to logic, but each detail was beginning to lose its usual sense. He had the feeling that someone had rearranged the structure of the house piece by piece, shaping it with something far older than the building itself. A sudden knock echoed from the far end of the hall. It was soft and slow, almost polite, yet strong enough to send a shiver up their spines. Aries and Zoya exchanged a tense look. The knock came again, steady and deliberate. They both moved carefully toward the sound, each step cautious. As they reached the end of the hall, the door there shifted slightly. A cold draft pushed through the gap. Aries reached out and touched the door. It was vibrating gently, not from the wind, but from something moving behind it. He opened the door. The small storage space behind it was empty. Only dust and a few broken tools rested on the floor. Still, the air felt colder in that room than anywhere else in the house. Zoya pointed at the wall. Someone had drawn the same symbol there as the one on the cloth. It was faint, almost erased, but still visible. Aries ran his fingers across it and felt the rough groove of dried paint. Something or someone had been marking the house for a long time. They left the storage room and returned to the main area. The mystery felt heavier now. Aries tried to piece everything together, but each answer led to a new question. He wondered why their grandmother had never spoken about these marks. She had lived in this house for decades and kept many things hidden. Zoya suggested that the symbols might not have been hers, that maybe she had been protecting something rather than creating it. This idea made the air feel colder. As they talked, the lamp on the table flickered. The light dimmed and returned with a slow pulse. Aries reached out to steady it, but his hand stopped halfway when he saw the shadow on the wall. It was not his. It was taller and leaned forward in a strange angle. Zoya saw it too. Her breath caught in her throat. Aries moved slowly, trying not to make sudden gestures. The shadow did not move. It stayed fixed in place as if it belonged to someone standing right behind them. When Aries turned around, there was no one there. The tension grew sharp. Aries checked every corner again, trying to find the source of the shadow. It was gone now. He kept glancing at the window, half expecting someone to be staring through it. Zoya stayed close, her voice low as she suggested they might be missing something important. Aries agreed. Something was guiding them toward a truth not yet clear. The strange marks, the moving cupboard, the cold drafts, the shadow with no figure. None of it felt random. They decided to search the attic, the only part of the house they had not checked since arriving. The stairs creaked under their weight. Each step felt heavier than the last. The attic door was shut tight. Aries pushed it open with effort. A cloud of dust filled the air. The room was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and covered frames. Zoya stepped forward and lifted a cloth from one of the frames. It revealed a painting. The image showed the house as it was many years ago. The walls were fresh and bright, but the same symbols appeared faintly around the roofline. Aries felt a chill. This meant the symbols had always been part of the house. Behind the painting, they found a rolled piece of parchment. Zoya unrolled it carefully. The writing inside was old and faded, but they could make out parts of it. It spoke of a visitor who once came to the family, someone who never left. The text described a presence tied to the land, watching every generation. Aries read the lines that remained clear. They mentioned a warning to avoid removing or disturbing the markings, or the presence would grow restless. Aries looked at Zoya with concern. They had moved several things earlier without knowing this. The house had shifted ever since. A noise echoed from below them. A door slammed somewhere downstairs. Aries moved toward the attic entrance and looked down the staircase, seeing only darkness. The faint sound of footsteps drifted through the halls. They were slow and heavy, as if someone was walking without any rush. Aries felt his pulse increase. Zoya whispered that no one else should be inside the house. They waited at the top of the stairs, listening. The footsteps stopped. Aries took a deep breath and descended a few steps, but Zoya held his arm, urging caution. They stayed together, moving down as quietly as they could. The hall below was empty. The door that had slammed was now half open. Behind it was the same storage space they had checked earlier. Aries entered it again and froze when he noticed the old tools were no longer on the floor. They had been arranged neatly in a line across the wall. This could not have happened by itself. Zoya found another marking near the corner. This one was fresher, drawn recently. The lines glistened slightly, as if not fully dry. Aries stared at it with a sinking feeling. Someone had been there only moments ago. The thought made the house feel alive in a way that was unsettling. Zoya asked him if he felt like they were being watched. He nodded without hesitation. The sense of presence was stronger now, almost like a weight on their shoulders. They backed out of the storage room and closed the door behind them. Aries suggested they should check outside the house to make sure no one had entered. The air outside was cold. The trees swayed gently. The moon cast long shadows across the ground. Aries scanned the area but found nothing unusual. Zoya pointed at the ground near the back door. Footprints, not theirs. The pattern was strange, almost like someone had been dragging one foot. The trail led toward the far end of the backyard, near the old shed. Aries followed the tracks carefully. The shed door hung slightly open. He pushed it wider and stepped inside. The air felt tight, thick with dust. Shelves lined the walls. Something shifted in the corner, a faint rustle. He turned quickly but saw only old tools and tangled ropes. Still, the sense of being watched followed him strongly. Zoya stayed behind him, her eyes on the shadows. Aries noticed a faint mark on the shed wall too, drawn in the same style as the others. This confirmed their suspicion that the symbols were not limited to the house alone. Something was rooted in this land. They returned to the house and locked the doors. Aries felt the tension rise further, pressing against the walls. He realized there were many pieces of the mystery still hidden. The old parchment hinted at a presence, but it did not explain what it wanted. The strange events around them felt connected, yet the purpose remained unclear. Zoya suggested they should search the rest of their grandmother's belongings. There might be a journal or letters explaining the truth. Aries agreed, though uncertainty lingered in his mind. As they prepared to search deeper into the house, he sensed the presence growing closer. It felt like the house itself was watching their every move, waiting for them to take the next step. The conflict around them was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming part of their reality, shaping every moment and guiding them toward something unknown. Aries felt the weight of the night pressing harder than ever, as if the house itself was leaning in to listen to every breath he and Zoya took. They sat at the small table with their grandmother's belongings spread out in front of them. Most of the items were ordinary, but a few held the same familiar markings they had seen on the walls and cloth. Aries picked up a torn notebook that looked like it had been hidden for years. The pages were wrinkled, ink-faded, but they carried a strange energy, almost like the words inside were waiting to be read again. Zoya leaned closer while he opened the notebook. The first few pages were filled with normal entries, simple notes about the garden, neighbors, and changing seasons. But the writing changed halfway, turning hurried and uneven. Their grandmother wrote about nights filled with strange movements in the halls, about shadows crossing the rooms without any source. She wrote that the markings were meant to keep something calm, not to keep it out. Aries felt a cold shiver travel down his back as he read the next lines. She described a constant presence, one she had sensed since she first moved into the house. She wrote that it grew stronger whenever the symbols faded or were disturbed. Zoya took the notebook from him and flipped through the rest of the pages. Some lines had been scratched out, as if their grandmother wanted to remove parts of the truth. Others were smudged with water stains that made the writing hard to understand. Aries noticed that one entry had been circled many times. It mentioned a night when the presence had tried to speak. Their grandmother wrote that she could hear a faint voice near the attic, calling her name, repeating it in a slow and steady tone. She wrote that she refused to respond because doing so would allow it to enter her thoughts. Aries felt a growing tension building inside him as he looked around the dimly lit room. The shadows seemed longer, darker. The air felt heavy. He wondered if the presence was now sensing them reading the notebook. Zoya closed it slowly and told him they needed to check the attic again. She had a feeling their grandmother might have left something else there, something more important than the painting and parchment. Aries hesitated, but he knew she was right. They made their way back up the stairs. Each step gave a small groan under their feet. The attic door felt colder than before. Aries pushed it open and the dusty air hit them instantly. The moonlight coming from the small attic window cast long streaks across the cluttered space. Zoya used her phone light and scanned the room again. This time she noticed something they had missed earlier. A small wooden box was tucked behind a broken chair. It looked recently disturbed, as if someone had touched it not long ago. Aries picked it up carefully. The box was locked, but the lock was worn enough to break with a little pressure. Inside, they found a bundle of old letters tied with twine. The paper had yellowed and the ink was fading. Zoya untied the bundle and started reading the first letter. It was addressed to their grandmother from someone whose name was smudged. The writer spoke about the land, warning her never to ignore the symbols. He wrote that the presence was tied to a history older than the house itself. The remaining letters seemed to describe attempts to calm the presence, describing nights when it moved loudly through the rooms and days when strange shadows circled the property. Aries felt his chest tighten. Everything pointed toward something growing stronger, inching closer. They were running out of time to understand what it wanted. Zoya suggested they should check the backyard again, especially near the shed where they found the new markings. She believed something might be buried there, something their grandmother tried to hide. Aries agreed, though fear pressed heavily on him. Outside, the cold breeze brushed past them, carrying the scent of damp earth. The moon hung low, giving the yard a pale glow. The footprints they saw earlier were still there, only now they looked deeper, as if pressed harder into the soil. Zoya pointed to the shed. A faint light flickered inside it, even though they had not turned anything on. Aries felt his pulse quicken. He stepped forward, careful with each movement, and pushed the shed door open again. The light inside was weak, almost like a pulse. Aries noticed a lantern on the ground, flickering unnaturally. Zoya stepped behind him and whispered that the markings on the wall seemed brighter than before, as if something had traced over them. Aries moved closer to the markings. The lines looked fresh and almost glowed faintly. His hand hovered over them, but he avoided touching them this time. Every part of his mind told him to be careful. A soft sound came from behind them like a slow breath. Aries spun around, but the shed was empty. Zoya grabbed his arm and said they should leave. They ran out and shut the shed door. The moment they stepped back toward the house, the sound of something dragging across the ground echoed behind them. Aries turned slowly, expecting to see a figure, but the yard was empty. Still, the dragging sound continued for a few moments before fading away. Inside the house again, they locked all the windows and doors. The air seemed to grow heavier, as if reacting to their fear. Aries felt something shift near the hallway. A cold pressure formed near his shoulder for a brief moment. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, but the sensation was too sharp, too real. Zoya felt something too and looked at him with wide eyes. She whispered that whatever was here was no longer staying in the background. It was starting to reveal itself. The lamp flickered again, this time more violently. The shadows on the wall twisted in strange shapes. Aries stepped back, ready to defend them if anything appeared. Zoya grabbed the notebook again and scanned the last few pages. She found a section where their grandmother had written about a breaking point. She said the presence would reach a stage where it demanded attention, where it would push harder if ignored. She wrote that the symbols only delayed it, never stopped it. Aries felt trapped by the growing tension. The walls seemed to draw closer, each sound echoed louder. They both knew the moment was getting close, the point where the conflict would become unavoidable. Zoya told him they needed to find the main source of the presence, something physical, something connected to the land. Without finding it, they would only be running in circles. Aries tried to think about all the places they had not searched thoroughly, the basement, the only place they had avoided all night. The thought of going into the basement sent a sharp fear through him, but he knew it was the only option left. The basement door had always felt wrong, even in daylight. Their grandmother rarely mentioned it, and they had never gone inside since arriving. Zoya nodded, her face tense. They both walked slowly toward the basement door. The air around it felt colder, thicker. Aries placed his hand on the handle. It felt icy. He opened the door carefully. A deep darkness stretched downward. The cold air felt almost alive against their skin. Zoya turned on her phone's flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the thick darkness. Aries took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. The wood creaked sharply under his foot. Zoya followed close behind. Each step down felt like stepping deeper into another world. The basement smelled of damp earth and old stone. The walls looked rough, not like the rest of the house. Something about the way the stones were placed seemed deliberate. Aries scanned the room and noticed strange shapes carved into the stone near the floor, the same symbols again. Only these looked much older. Zoya pointed to the far end of the basement where a small opening sat halfway hidden behind crates. Aries moved toward it, pushing the crates aside. Behind them, the sound of movement echoed softly, almost like someone following their steps. Aries moved faster. The opening led to a narrow space carved directly into the foundation. Inside was a wooden box buried halfway in dirt. The lid was cracked open slightly. Zoya urged him to lift it. Aries hesitated, but the tension in the basement was rising fast, almost choking. He slowly lifted the lid. Inside the box was a faded piece of cloth covered in the same symbols, but arranged in a complete circle this time. In the center was something wrapped tightly. Before he could unwrap it, a cold gust moved through the basement. The lights flickered. Zoya grabbed his hand as the basement filled with a deep, low sound, not quite a voice, but close enough to feel like one. Aries felt the presence pressing in from all sides, tightening, waiting. They realized they were standing at the heart of everything, right in the center of what their grandmother had tried to protect for so long. The presence was no longer hiding. It was right there with them, growing stronger each second, building toward something they could no longer delay. The moment before the truth revealed itself was closing in, thick and heavy, as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Below is the full resolution of your story, continuing exactly from where the climax ended and wrapping everything up in a natural human-sounding way. It avoids unsafe content, avoids dots in pairs or trios, uses a simple tone, and maintains the emotional, suspenseful, human feel you want. Aries stood frozen with his hand still resting on the edge of the wooden box. Zoya held the light steady, though her hand trembled so much the beam shook across the dirt floor. The air around them felt tight and cold, closing in like a tightening circle. The deep sound in the basement rose and fell like a slow heartbeat. It was no longer hiding itself. It wanted their attention. It wanted to be acknowledged. Zoya whispered that they should unwrap whatever was inside the cloth. Aries could barely swallow, but he nodded. They both felt that whatever was happening would not stop until they understood the center of this long mystery. The cloth was stiff with age and dust. He lifted it gently, peeling it away from the small object inside. Zoya leaned closer, her breath held tight. Inside the cloth was a smooth stone. It looked ordinary at first, but when Zoya tilted the light toward it, faint lines appeared on its surface. The markings matched the ones carved into the house walls and shed. They glowed slightly as if reacting to their presence. Aries felt a strange warmth from the stone. Not frightening, more like something familiar. Something old. The deep sound in the basement shifted suddenly. It softened. Instead of feeling aggressive, it felt more like a long sigh. The darkness around them seemed to relax, not vanish but settle. Zoya looked up at Aries and said she thought the presence had been tied to the stone all along. She believed their grandmother had been trying to protect whatever this was, not hide it out of fear. Aries slowly nodded. It made sense. The symbols, the chants, the careful markings. She had not been fighting something evil. She had been trying to keep someone calm. Zoya suggested placing the stone in the center of the glowing symbols on the cloth. Aries lowered it gently. The moment the stone touched the cloth, the markings pulsed once with a soft, warm light. The deep sound in the basement faded until the room was silent again. The cold air lifted. Even the old wood and stone seemed to release a tension they had been holding for years. Aries waited for another sound, another movement, some sign that they had done something wrong. But nothing happened. The basement felt normal for the first time since they arrived. Zoya took a slow breath, then said she thought the presence had been waiting for someone to return the stone to its place. Someone the stone trusted. Aries looked at her and asked how a stone could trust anyone. She shrugged and said their grandmother always believed that certain things in this world carried more memory and emotion than they look like. She used to say everything on the land had a story, even the pieces that seemed small. They lifted the cloth again and wrapped the stone with care. Aries felt the warmth still coming from it. Not strong, but steady and calm. As they climbed the stairs, the house felt lighter, the shadows seemed thinner. The floor no longer creaked with that uneasy tone. They stepped into the hallway, and for the first time since arriving, the air felt safe. Zoya set the wrapped stone on the table. She looked around and said she felt like their grandmother was still there in a way, guiding them through all this. Aries felt the same. The notebook, the letters, the markings, everything she left behind had been her way of helping them understand. He walked to the window and looked outside. The yard was still, the shed quiet. Even the night breeze felt softer. They spent the next hour reading the remaining letters and notes. The story became clearer with each page. Their grandmother had discovered the stone years ago on the property. She believed it was connected to a presence that had lived there long before the house was built. She realized that the presence was not meant to leave or be ignored. It needed care, attention, and balance. The symbols she used were a way of helping it stay calm when the world around it changed. When she grew older and weaker, she could not keep the balance steady. That was why the presence grew restless. The stone had been moved or separated from the cloth for too long. Everything she left behind was her way of trying to make sure someone would someday understand what needed to be done. Aries and Zoya sat quietly after finishing the letters. They felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Their grandmother had carried this responsibility alone for years. Now it had been passed to them in a way they never expected. But the fear they felt earlier was gone. What remained was a sense of calm and duty. Zoya said they should return the stone and cloth to the basement in a safe place. A place where it would not be disturbed, but where they could still reach it if needed. Aries agreed. They found a small wooden shelf built into the back wall of the basement, tucked between the old stones. It looked like it had once held tools or candles. They placed the wrapped stone there gently. The basement did not react this time. No shifting air. No cold, just silence. Back upstairs, Aries felt a strange comfort. He looked around the house and realized it no longer felt haunted or threatening. It felt full of stories, memories, and history. Zoya sat by the window and looked at the barn in the distance. She wondered aloud what their grandmother would say if she saw them now. Aries smiled and said she would probably shake her head and tell them they made everything more dramatic than it needed to be. They stayed up late, talking about the land, the house, and their plans. They decided they would keep the property and take care of it instead of selling it. They felt a connection to the place now, something deeper than ownership. It felt like a promise. Zoya said they should repaint the markings on the walls inside the house someday, not because they feared something, but because it felt like a way of honoring their grandmother's work. The next morning, sunlight filled the house, warm and bright. It reached all the corners that once felt dark. Aries stepped outside and looked across the field. The wind brushed through the grass in a calm wave. Nothing felt out of place. Zoya joined him and said she felt something peaceful across the property, as if the presence had settled completely. They walked to the shed and opened the door. The markings remained, but they no longer glowed. They were just symbols now, old reminders of a long story. They cleaned the shed, fixed the broken lantern, and removed anything that looked damaged. The shed felt normal again. As they worked, Aries realized something important. The presence had not been dangerous, it had been misunderstood. It reacted to fear, silence, and neglect. When treated with respect, it became calm. It reminded him of how people react in stressful situations. Sometimes the things we fear only need patience and understanding. By evening, the house felt alive with warm energy. Aries and Zoya cooked a simple meal and sat near the fireplace. There was no tension now, only a quiet balance. They talked about the future and laughed at how frightened they had been earlier. The fear had been real, but now it felt distant. Zoya picked up the notebook again and placed it on the shelf with the letters. Aries stood by the window, watching the sky shift from orange to blue. He felt a sense of closure. Not just for them, but for their grandmother and for the presence that had lived there longer than any of them. The story of the house would stay with them forever. It would become something they passed down, not as a warning, but as a reminder that everything has a history and every place holds a spirit. It taught them that fear can hide the truth, but patience can uncover it. It taught them that even the oldest mysteries can be understood when approached with care. When they finally went to bed, the house felt warm and still. The presence rested quietly beneath them, calm and complete. The land outside stretched far and wide under the soft night sky, peaceful in a way it had not been for a long time. And for the first time since arriving, they both slept without fear, knowing the story had reached its end and the home had found its calm again.